Welcome in, everybody. We're diving deep today into the Book of Deuteronomy. Um, it's this kind of like hidden gem at the end of the Torah.
Yeah, a lot of people kind of skip over it.
They do. But, our listeners are a curious bunch. They want to know more about this book, and
Mm.
we're going to uncover some of its treasures together.
I think they'll be surprised by what we find. It's not just a list of rules and regulations.
Right.
There's so much more to it. It's got speeches that have echoed through history, um, hints of mystery even, and a fascinating glimpse into ancient Israelite culture.
And this is where your expertise comes in.
Well, one of the things that makes Deuteronomy so fascinating to me is how it acts like a bridge.
A bridge. Okay, I like that.
It connects Israel's past experiences, their escape from slavery, all those years wandering in the wilderness, to the future that was waiting for them as they prepared to enter the Promised Land. It's this pivotal point, not just historically,
Right.
but in terms of their relationship with God.
It's like everything is coming together.
Exactly.
So let's set the stage a bit. Based on what we've been reading, Deuteronomy takes place right before the Israelites cross the Jordan River into Canaan.
Yeah, right on the cusp of the Promised Land.
And we're talking about a new generation here, right? These are the folks who were born during those 40 years in the wilderness.
Right. A whole generation that had never known anything but the wilderness.
Wow.
And Moses, their leader, he's giving them this series of speeches to prepare them for what lies ahead.
Okay, so imagine that scene for a second. It's Moses and this new generation poised to enter the Promised Land. And these speeches, that's what makes up the Book of Deuteronomy.
It's powerful stuff. It really is. And that context is key to understanding it. I mean, think about it. These aren't just any people. They've been shaped by this nomadic existence, witnessed their parents' rebellion and God's faithfulness firsthand.
Wow, it's like they've been through a crash course in faith.
Yeah, exactly. And Deuteronomy speaks directly to their unique situation as they stand on the brink of inheriting a land and building a nation.
It's a new chapter for them and a new set of challenges, too.
Absolutely.
And speaking of Deuteronomy, even the name Deuteronomy has this kind of intriguing ring to it.
Oh, yeah, it definitely does.
It means second law.
Right. Second law, which, at first glance might sound like a rehash of what they already got at Mount Sinai.
Yeah, like, haven't we heard all this before?
Right, but it's so much more than that. Imagine, if you will, your parents giving you advice as a teenager.
Oh, I've heard it all, believe me.
Right, you've heard it all before. But then as you're approaching adulthood, those same words take on a new weight, a deeper meaning.
Because you're about to go out and actually live it.
Exactly. And that's exactly what's happening here with Deuteronomy. Moses is taking those foundational laws from Mount Sinai, and he's reframing them, adapting them for this new generation facing this radically different set of challenges.
So it's not just repetition. It's reinterpretation.
Exactly. It's taking those core principles and applying them to a new situation.
Fascinating. Okay, so we've got these two outer sections of Moses' speeches, kind of bookending this central core of laws.
Right, like a sandwich.
Which brings us to, I think, the heart of Deuteronomy.
Yeah.
The laws themselves.
Yeah, getting down to the nitty-gritty.
I'll be honest, sometimes when I hear laws in the Bible, I kind of zone out a bit.
It can be a little daunting.
It can, but you're telling me there's more to it than just a list of do's and don'ts.
Oh, yeah, way more. These laws reflect something much deeper, God's vision for a just society, a people who would reflect his character to the world. And you have to consider the societies surrounding Israel at that time, places like Syria and Babylon. Their laws were often brutal, focused on maintaining power and control.
Yeah, a very different picture.
Totally.
Yeah.
And the laws in Deuteronomy offer this stark contrast. They push Israel toward this higher level of ethical behavior and social responsibility.
It's setting a whole new standard.
It really is. It's about creating a society that's radically different from what surrounded them.
I love that. Okay, so we've got to talk about one of the most famous passages in Deuteronomy, the Shema.
Oh, yeah.
Hear, O Israel, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. This declaration, it was meant to be recited daily.
Yeah, a cornerstone of their faith.
But what's the significance of that? Beyond just, saying the words.
It's about so much more than just lip service. The Hebrew word for hear in that passage, Shema, it implies active obedience. It's a response to what you hear.
So it's not passive. It's about doing something.
Right. It's about putting faith into action. And the word love, it's not just this warm, fuzzy feeling. It signifies wholehearted devotion to God engaging your will, your emotions, your intellect.
It's about surrendering to God's authority,
Yeah.
letting his guidance shape your life.
Exactly. It's about letting that love transform you from the inside out.
Wow, that's powerful.
Yeah.
Okay, so this radical idea of loving God with your whole being, living by these laws, it was meant to make Israel a kingdom of priests.
Yeah, that's a pretty bold claim, isn't it?
It is. What were they supposed to be showcasing to the world?
Well, imagine this. You've got a world that's steeped in polytheism, where every aspect of creation has its own deity.
Right.
And here you have Israel called to represent the one true God, the Creator. They're meant to be this model nation demonstrating what a society built on God's principles looks like.
It's like they're called to be different.
Yes, a radical departure from the norms of their time. It was a revolutionary concept.
And this emphasis on worshiping the one true God, living by his laws, that's what leads to life and blessing, according to Deuteronomy. Idol worship, on the other hand, is depicted as this destructive force leading to all sorts of societal ills.
Exactly. And that statement, the Lord is one, it directly challenges those polytheistic beliefs that were so prevalent in the ancient Near East. It was a revolutionary declaration affirming Yahweh's singularity and supremacy over all other deities.
A powerful statement. So let's dig into these laws a bit further. We've got categories covering worship, leadership, civil life, social justice.
It's comprehensive, it really is.
It seems like every aspect of Israelite society is touched upon.
And what's fascinating is how these different categories intertwine. They reflect this holistic understanding of how faith should permeate every aspect of life. Take, for example, the laws about caring for the poor, widows, orphans, immigrants.
Right. Those laws were so central to their society.
They were, and they weren't just seen as acts of charity. They were acts of worship, expressions of obedience to a God who values justice and compassion.
Right. It wasn't just about rituals and ceremonies. It was about how you lived your life, how you treated others.
Exactly. It was about putting your faith into action in very tangible ways. And, that highlights how different these laws were from what surrounded them. They weren't just about maintaining order.
Right.
They were about creating this just and compassionate society.
And you know what's striking to me is even those seemingly small details, like the law about not muzzling an ox while it's threshing grain.
Deuteronomy 25.4.
Yes, that one. Speak to this concern for fairness and compassion. And centuries later, Paul the Apostle even uses this very law
Yeah, she does.
to make a point about fair compensation for those who labor.
It's incredible how these principles transcended time and context.
It really is. Okay, so Moses has painted this picture of life and blessing that flows from obedience to God's law.
Right.
But then he drops what feels like a bombshell.
Oh, yeah.
He warns them about the consequences of disobedience, essentially saying, choose blessing or curse life or death.
It's intense. It's a stark choice.
It is. Is he just trying to scare them into line?
Well, it's more than that. I think it reveals something profound about the nature of the covenant between God and Israel.
Okay, unpack that for me.
This wasn't just a one-sided guarantee, It wasn't just God saying, I'll bless you no matter what. It involved both blessings for obedience and consequences for rebellion.
So it was a two-way street.
Exactly. A relationship built on mutual responsibility.
Okay, that makes sense. And what's even more surprising to me is that Moses predicts they will rebel.
Yeah.
It's like he's saying, look, I know you're going to mess this up.
He'd seen it all before, hadn't he?
It feels almost pessimistic, especially after all that talk about choosing life and blessing.
But you have to remember, Moses had spent 40 years leading these people. He'd seen their grumbling, their complaining, their tendency to turn away from God.
Right, 40 years in the wilderness.
Exactly. So his prediction wasn't pessimism, it was realism. It was this sobering acknowledgement of human nature.
Okay, I can see that.
But in the midst of what feels like a pretty bleak forecast, there's this glimmer of hope.
Right.
Moses talks about God circumcising your heart so that true love and obedience become possible. What does that even mean?
It's this powerful metaphor, and it gets to the heart of what's wrong with humanity.
Okay, tell me more.
It suggests that something is fundamentally broken within us. Our heart's hardened and resistant to God. It's a condition that goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden, to that first act of rebellion. But God offers a solution, a transformation of the heart,
Okay.
making it capable of genuine love and obedience.
So it's not just about external actions, it's about this internal change. Right, it's about the heart. And that idea of a circumcised heart, it's picked up by later prophets, right? Like Jeremiah and Ezekiel, who also talk about the need for a new heart. They recognize that true relationship with God requires a heart that's receptive to his will, a heart that delights in his ways.
And that's not something we can just manufacture on our own.
No, it's a gift. Picking up where we left off, we were talking about that transformed heart. And I think it's important to see how Deuteronomy doesn't just stand alone. It's not
Yeah.
this isolated book.
Right.
It actually connects to this grand narrative of the Bible.
So you're saying it's not just about those ancient Israelites and their specific situation.
Exactly. It's like a seed containing the DNA of themes that will blossom throughout the rest of Scripture.
Okay, I like that analogy, a seed. So these ideas we've been discussing, covenant obedience, this radical transformation of the heart, they don't just stay confined to this one book.
Not at all. Let's consider the historical books that come after Deuteronomy. Joshua, Judges, Kings, they tell the story of Israel's journey into the Promised Land, their rise and fall as a nation. And guess what?
I'm intrigued.
The themes of blessing and curse, faithfulness and rebellion, they play out in dramatic ways. It's like they're living out the very choices that Moses laid before them back in Deuteronomy.
So Deuteronomy is almost like a framework for understanding those later books.
It is. It's like a lens through which we can view their history. We can see how those future generations either embraced or rejected the covenant.
And the consequences unfold right before our eyes.
Precisely. And it doesn't start with the historical books. The prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, they constantly draw upon those themes from Deuteronomy.
Really?
Yeah. They're calling the people back to covenant faithfulness, reminding them of the consequences of straying from God's ways.
It's fascinating how those speeches of Moses delivered centuries earlier still had such a powerful resonance for them.
It's because they laid the foundation for understanding their relationship with God, their very identity as a people.
Wow. Okay, so we're seeing these connections throughout the Old Testament.
Mm-hmm.
But what about the New Testament? Does Deuteronomy have any relevance there?
Oh, absolutely. And here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay, I'll leave
This
that.
idea of needing more than just outward obedience, this yearning for a transformation of the heart, it anticipates the coming of Jesus. Remember that line from Deuteronomy about God circumcising the heart?
Yeah, the idea that true change has to come from within, that it's not enough to just go through the motions.
Exactly. Well, in the New Testament, we see Jesus fulfilling that promise.
Okay.
He talks about being born again, about the need for a new heart. He offers forgiveness and empowers his followers to live in a way that reflects that genuine heart-level transformation.
Wow, so Deuteronomy isn't just looking back. It's also looking forward. It's almost like a foreshadowing of the gospel message.
It is. It sets the stage for understanding God's plan of redemption, his desire to restore humanity to a right relationship with him. And that transformation, that new heart, it has implications for how we live in the world. It's not just about personal piety.
Okay.
It's about social justice, about caring for the vulnerable, just as those laws in Deuteronomy emphasized.
So Deuteronomy isn't just some isolated text.
No, it's not.
It has this ripple effect throughout the entire Bible. It's shaping the narrative, influencing the prophets, even anticipating the coming of Jesus. Pretty amazing for a book that often gets overlooked.
It really is. When we delve into Deuteronomy, we discover so much more than just a set of ancient laws.
Okay.
We encounter the heart of God, his desire for a just and compassionate society, and his longing for a genuine relationship with his people. It's a book that speaks to the deepest longings of the human heart.
When we started this, I thought we were just going to be talking about a bunch of rules.
I know, right?
But you've helped me see how Deuteronomy acts as this bridge connecting the past to the future, the Old Testament to the New Testament.
And it's bridging the gap between God and humanity, offering this glimpse into his character and his incredible plan for redemption.
Okay, so we've explored the historical and theological impact of Deuteronomy. But what about its relevance for us today? How do these ancient speeches and laws speak to our modern lives in the 21st century?
That's a great question. I think one of the most powerful takeaways from Deuteronomy is this invitation to examine our own hearts. Just like those Israelites standing on the edge of the Promised Land, we too are faced with choices.
Choices.
Yeah. Will we embrace God's ways, or will we choose our own path? Will we allow him to transform our hearts, or will we resist his work in our lives?
What really strikes me is the emphasis Deuteronomy places on justice and compassion,
Yes.
especially for those who are marginalized or vulnerable. It's a challenge for us to consider how we're living out those values in our own community.
Absolutely. Are we advocating for the poor and vulnerable? Are we seeking to create a more just and equitable society? These are the questions that Deuteronomy forces us to confront.
And those ancient laws, They weren't just arbitrary rules.
Right, they reflected God's heart for justice, his concern for the well-being of all people. And that call to justice, to love our neighbor as ourselves, it's just as relevant today as it was thousands of years ago.
I'm also thinking about those different categories of laws in Deuteronomy: worship, leadership, civil life, social justice. They weren't compartmentalized, were they?
Not at all. They were all interwoven, reflecting this holistic understanding of how faith should impact every area of life.
And that challenges us to consider how our faith is shaping our actions, our relationships, our engagement with the world around us.
Right. Are we living out our faith in a way that reflects the justice and compassion of God? That's the question.
Ooh, those are some tough questions, but they're important ones. Deuteronomy is really pushing us to go deeper, to think critically about how we're living our lives.
It is. It's not just an ancient text. It's a living word that speaks to us today. And, one of the things I find most encouraging about Deuteronomy is that it doesn't leave us without hope. Even though it acknowledges the reality of human rebellion, it points towards the possibility of transformation.
Right.
It reminds us that God is always working to draw us back to himself, to heal our brokenness, and to make us into the people he created us to be.
It's not about striving for perfection or earning God's favor.
No.
It's about surrendering to his transforming grace, allowing him to shape our hearts and guide our steps.
Exactly. It's a journey of faith, a process of becoming more and more like Christ.
Yeah.
And Deuteronomy provides a roadmap for that journey, a framework for understanding God's heart and his desire for our lives.
As we've been talking about Deuteronomy, I keep coming back to this idea of it being a second law.
Right.
We've touched on how it's more of a reinterpretation for a new generation, but I'm curious to see how that actually plays out in the text itself.
Yeah.
Are there any specific examples where we see laws being adapted or expanded upon?
That's a great question. And yes, there are some fascinating instances where Deuteronomy takes concepts from earlier in the Torah and reimagines them for this new context. One that immediately comes to mind is the evolution of the Sabbath year into the year of Jubilee.
Oh, right. The Sabbath year where the land was given a rest every 7 years. Farmers weren't supposed to plant crops and debts were to be forgiven. It was all about hitting a reset button, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It was this remarkable system designed to prevent the accumulation of wealth and power in the hands of a few, ensuring a level of economic and social balance within the community. Now, in Deuteronomy, we see this idea taken a step further with the introduction of the year of Jubilee.
Okay, so how did the Jubilee year differ from the Sabbath year?
Well, on top of everything from the Sabbath year, the Jubilee year also mandated that all ancestral lands be returned to their original families.
Wow.
Imagine that. And any Israelites who had fallen into slavery were to be set free. It was this radical redistribution of wealth and power, a system designed to prevent generational poverty and ensure a level playing field.
Wow, talk about a revolutionary concept. It really challenges our modern-day assumptions about property, wealth, and social responsibility.
It certainly does. And it highlights the radical nature of the laws in Deuteronomy, their commitment to justice and equality in a way that was unheard of in the ancient world.
These examples are really illuminating. It's like seeing those original laws through a new lens, understanding how they were adapted to meet the specific challenges this new generation was facing as they prepared to enter the Promised Land.
Precisely. And it underscores the fact that God's law isn't static or inflexible. It's meant to be this living, breathing guide that can be applied to different situations and contexts.
Okay, all this talk about laws and reinterpretations is fascinating, but I'd love to circle back to something that's been really sticking with me, this idea of a circumcised heart. You've talked about it being central to Deuteronomy, but honestly, I'm still struggling to grasp what it actually means.
It is a powerful image, isn't it? And one that can be easily misunderstood. Remember, in the ancient world, circumcision was this outward sign of belonging to the covenant community. But Moses is telling these Israelites that true belonging goes far deeper than a physical mark.
So what's he getting at then? What does a circumcised heart actually look like?
He's talking about an internal transformation, a change that goes beyond mere outward conformity to the law. It's about having a heart that's truly aligned with God's will, a heart that loves him and desires to obey him, not out of fear or obligation, but out of genuine devotion.
That makes sense. But it also raises the question, how does that kind of transformation happen? Can we just choose to have our hearts circumcised?
That's the crux of it, isn't it? And Deuteronomy acknowledges the limitations of human willpower. Left to our own devices, we're prone to wander, to rebel, to choose our own path over God's system. Our hearts, as the prophet Jeremiah put it, are deceitful above all things and desperately sick.
So if we can't change our own hearts, are we just stuck?
That's where the good news comes in. Deuteronomy points us to the fact that God offers to do for us what we can't do for ourselves. He promises to transform our hearts, to give us new desires, to empower us to live in a way that pleases Him.
So it's not about mustering up enough willpower or trying to earn God's favor. It's about surrendering to His grace
Yeah.
and allowing Him to work in us.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that this transformation, this journey of the heart, isn't a one-time event. It's an ongoing process, a lifelong adventure of drawing closer to God and allowing Him to shape us more and more into His image. There will be stumbles along the way, times when we stray, but His grace is always there to pick us up and set us back on course.
This has been an incredibly enriching conversation.
Yeah.
When we started this deep dive, I had no idea how much depth and relevance we'd find in the Book of Deuteronomy, so much more than just a dusty collection of ancient laws.
I agree. It's a book that speaks powerfully to the human condition, to our longing for meaning, purpose, and relationship with God. It challenges us to examine our own hearts, to pursue justice and compassion, and to live lives that reflect the transformative power of God's grace.
Well said. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into Deuteronomy. I hope you found it as insightful and thought-provoking as I have.
Me too. And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this journey of discovery. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking the truth.